They left an 8-year-old boy under a bridge, and he still remembered their plate.
The 14th of December arrived the way it always did for Garrett Briggs. Not with noise, not with ceremony. It arrived like a slow leak in a tire, quiet and steady and impossible to stop once it started, a cold pressure building in his chest from the moment he opened his eyes in the dark at 4 in the morning and remembered what day it was. He lay on his back for a long time staring at the water-stained ceiling of the bedroom above the clubhouse. Nora slept beside him, her breathing deep and even, one hand resting open on the pillow between them, like she was waiting for something to land there. He did not wake her. He never woke her on this day. That was their unspoken agreement, forged over years of watching him disappear into himself every December, a ghost walking through his own life for 24 hours before crawling back out the other side. Garrett was 54 years old. He stood 6 feet 4 inches and weighed 240 pounds of hard-living road miles and decisions he would carry to his grave. His beard was iron gray, thick and tangled, the kind that took decades to earn. His hands were the size of small shovels, cracked at the knuckles, permanently stained with grease that no amount of soap fully removed. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, a souvenir from a disagreement in a bar parking lot in Youngstown 17 years ago. The man who gave him that scar had not fared as well. He was the president of the Iron Ravens Motorcycle Club Harlan County Charter in the Rust Belt of northeastern Ohio. He had held that position for 11 years. Men twice as mean and half as smart had tried to take it from him. None had succeeded. The Iron Ravens were not saints. They operated in the gray and violent margins of a world most people preferred not to think about. But within that world, Garrett Briggs was something like a law unto himself, a man whose word once given was more binding than any document a courthouse could produce. None of that mattered on December 14th. He pulled on his jeans and a heavy flannel in the dark, moving quietly, and made his way downstairs to the main room of the clubhouse. The space was enormous and low-ceilinged, a retrofitted cinder block warehouse that smelled of stale beer, pine floor cleaner, and decades of accumulated cigarette smoke. Pool tables sat empty under their plastic covers. The neon beer signs along the back wall hummed with a dull amber light. The jukebox was dark and silent. Garrett went behind the bar. He pulled down a bottle of Jack Daniels and set a clean rocks glass beside it. He poured 2 fingers. He did not drink it. He never drank it. He just poured it and set it there the way some men left flowers at a grave. It was ritual. It was the only form of prayer he knew. From beneath the bar, he retrieved a small wooden cigar box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of soft chamois cloth, was a photograph. He set it on the bar top and looked at it in the amber light. A little girl, 6 years old, gap-toothed smile, her dark hair and uneven pigtails, that she had done herself that morning, because she was fiercely independent, even at 6. She was sitting on the gas tank of his Harley, both small hands gripping the handlebars, her face split wide open with joy. She was wearing a tiny leather vest he had made for her out of scraps from the shop. On the back, in his own rough hand, he had painted a small set of wings. Her name was Grace Ellen Briggs. She had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 11 days after that photograph was taken. She had lived for 4 months after the diagnosis. She had died on December 14th, 18 years ago, in a hospital bed in Cleveland, with Garrett holding one hand and Nora holding the other, and the room had been very quiet, and outside the window, it had been snowing then too. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not cry. He had run out of tears for Grace somewhere around the 5th year. What remained now was something harder and quieter, a dense permanent weight behind his sternum, something he had learned to carry the way a man learns to carry a bad knee, always there, always present, occasionally catching him off guard with a sudden sharp flare of pain. He was still sitting there, the untouched glass of bourbon beside the photograph, when the side door crashed open. The sound was violent. The heavy steel door hit the cinder block wall with a sound like a gunshot, and the winter night howled into the room, bringing with it a swirl of hard granular snow and a blast of freezing air that extinguished the warmth instantly. Garrett was on his feet before he had consciously decided to move his hand, dropping to the knife on his belt, every nerve ending firing. Nora Cross stumbled through the doorway. She was covered in white powder, crusted from head to toe. Her heavy leather riding cut was sheeted with ice. Her face framed by streaks of iron gray hair escaping her helmet was bone white except for her lips, which had gone a terrifying shade of blue. She was shaking so violently her teeth were audible from across the room. But her eyes when they found Garrett were not panicked. Nora Cross had been riding with the Iron Ravens for 20 years. She did not panic. Her eyes were urgent and direct, carrying a message too large for words. She was holding something against her chest. Her jacket was zipped up high and she had both arms crossed over it, pressed inward, like she was trying to keep something from escaping or from dying. Whatever it was small. It moved. A barely perceptible shift beneath the leather, a tremor that was not hers. Garrett crossed the room in 4 strides. "Clear the table," Nora said. Her voice was raw, scraped hollow by the cold and the wind. "Clear the back pool table now." He did not ask questions. He had been married to Nora for 15 years. In those 15 years, she had never come through a door looking like that. He grabbed the plastic cover off the nearest pool table, swept it aside, and shoved the rack of cues out of the way in one continuous motion. Nora was already at the table. She began unzipping her jacket with fingers that were shaking almost too badly to function. Garrett reached over and pulled the zipper down for her. The jacket fell open. The boy inside was not moving. He was perhaps 8 years old, small for his age, with the kind of thinness that takes months to achieve. His skin was the color of old candle wax, translucent and papery, stretched too tight over the architecture of his face. His lips were the dark bruised purple of a deep cold injury. Snow had drifted over his eyelashes and frozen there, sealing them shut. He was wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt over a stained thermal undershirt and a corduroy jacket that had frozen rigid as sheet metal. His ankles, visible between the hem of his jeans and the tops of his socks, were bare and gray-blue. Nora lifted him out and laid him on the green felt. He weighed almost nothing. He made no sound. Garrett stood at the table and looked down at the boy under the harsh pool lamp. The amber neon hummed. The space heater ticked in the corner. Everything else had gone very still. The boy lay on the green, felt looking so much smaller than a child should ever look that something in the back of Garrett Briggs's chest shifted in a way he had not felt in a very long time. He knew what day it was. He knew who he had been sitting here thinking about. He knew the particular quality of this stillness and what it matched. Garrett. Nora's voice cut through, sharp, focused. He needs help right now. Garrett stepped back from the table. He crossed the room and pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were steady. His face gave nothing away. He dialed Dex Vaughn first. Dex had done 3 tours as a combat medic with the Army before a roadside bomb in the Korengal Valley ended his military career and started his career with the Iron Ravens. He knew things about keeping a body alive that most doctors had never learned. Then he dialed Doc Elias. Then he stepped back to the wall and crossed his arms over his chest and watched. He watched because he could not help. He had learned this about himself 18 years ago in a hospital room in Cleveland. There was a particular kind of helplessness that overtook him in the presence of a sick or injured child, a freezing of the mechanism, a short circuit between his brain and his hands. He was a man who had spent his adult life being useful in crises. In this specific crisis, he was not useful. He knew it. He accepted it. He stayed in the room anyway. Nora had not stopped moving since she came through the door. She was talking while she worked her voice low and rapid, telling him what she had found, while her hands checked the boy for breathing and pulse. Route 9 overpass, she said. Under the bridge. He was in a pile of old blankets and trash bags. I almost rode right past him. His pulse is there, but it keeps skipping. Garrett looked at the boy's hands hanging off the edge of the table. The fingers were a waxy, terrible yellow-white. He had seen that color before on a man who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite in a blizzard outside of Pittsburgh. Fletcher Mercer appeared in the doorway from the bunk rooms barefoot and squinting, his t-shirt untucked, drawn by the noise. Fletcher was 41, lean and sharp-featured, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of mind that could find a thread in any tangle of numbers or records. He had spent 12 years as a financial crimes investigator before a falling out with his department chief led him through a series of events he rarely discussed to the Iron Ravens. He was the charter's secretary, its institutional memory, and its most dangerous researcher. He took one look at the boy on the table. Then he looked at Garrett. "Who is he?" Fletcher said. "We do not know yet," Garrett said. "Where did he come from?" "Nora found him under the Route 9 overpass. Someone left him there." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, already working behind his eyes. Dex Vaughn arrived 12 minutes later, coming through the side door in a rush of cold air, his kit bag over one shoulder, still pulling his jacket on. He was 46, stocky, with a shaved head and a pair of hands that were paradoxically gentle for a man who looked like a linebacker. He crossed to the table without greeting anyone, set his bag down, and began his assessment in the systematic, unhurried manner of a man who had done triage in places where unhurried was the only thing that kept people alive. Doc Elias came 20 minutes after that, smelling of peppermint and rubbing alcohol, a battered black bag under his arm. He was 68, thin, with flyaway white hair and hands that shook slightly at rest, but steadied when he worked. He had lost his license a decade ago for reasons Garrett had never judged him for. He was the best diagnostician within 60 miles, and he kept his mouth shut. Both qualities were invaluable. The two men worked together at the table. Dex established that the boy was in stage 2 hypothermia with possible progression towards stage 3. He set up a warm saline IV line and began the process of raising his core temperature carefully too fast, and the heart becomes unstable. Doc Elias cut away the frozen clothes with surgical scissors, peeling them back layer by layer. The room had filled with a handful of other Iron Ravens, drawn by the commotion men, who stood at a respectful distance in the shadows, watching without speaking. Garrett stood at the wall with his arms folded. He was watching the boy the way he had watched Grace in those final weeks, with the particular fierce attention of a man who cannot do anything useful, but refuses to look away. The boy was a skeleton draped in skin, his ribs pushed against his translucent chest wall, each one distinct. His stomach was deeply concave in a way that spoke not of a few missed meals, but of sustained, deliberate deprivation. His elbows and knees were knobs of bone with nothing around them. Then Dex said quietly, "Garrett, come here." Garrett pushed off the wall. He came to the table and looked at what Dex was indicating. Along the boy's left side, from his armpit to his hip, were bruises, not the random scatter of a clumsy child's impact injuries. These were clustered, deliberate, patterned. Some were old, faded to the sickly yellow-green of deep healing. Some were recent, the capillaries ruptured close to the surface. Several were shaped like elongated ovals, consistent with a closed fist driven into the ribs repeatedly. "Turn him," Garrett said. His voice was flat. Dex and Nora moved the boy carefully onto his side. Garrett looked at the boy's back. Down the spine, spaced at irregular intervals from the shoulder blades to the lower lumbar region, were circular marks. They were perfect circles, each one approximately the diameter of a cigarette tip. They were in different stages of healing. Some had become smooth, shiny scar tissue, old enough that they had fully healed and rehealed. Some were weeks old in the scabbing phase. Some were fresh and red and raw, the tissue around them still inflamed. Someone had used this child as an ashtray. Repeatedly, over a span of at least a year, judging by the range of scar ages. Garrett stood looking at the boy's back without speaking. Doc Elias cleared his throat. "There is something else." He indicated the boy's right hand. The index finger had healed at a 10-degree deviation from its natural plane. The bone had been broken and had knitted together, crooked, unsupported, unset. No cast, no splint, no medical attention. It had simply been left to fuse however it would. "That break is at least 2 years old," Doc Elias said. "Possibly older." Garrett stepped back from the table. He walked to the side door. He opened it and stepped outside into the blizzard, pulling it shut behind him. The wind hit him immediately, driving pellets of frozen snow against his face and neck. He stood on the loading dock without a jacket and let the cold work on him. He looked out at the compound yard, at the bikes covered in white, at the chain-link fence barely visible through the whiteout. In 18 years, he had not wept for Grace. The grief had calcified into something he carried rather than shed. But standing in the blizzard on the 14th of December, with the image of those circular burn marks behind his eyes, he felt something shift in the calcified mass. Not breaking. Something moving like a fault line, adjusting under enormous pressure. He stood out there for 4 minutes. Then he went back inside. He was a president again by the time the door closed behind him. Doc Elias was finishing his examination when Garrett returned to the table. The boy had been rewrapped in heated moving blankets, a process Dex had engineered using an industrial heat gun and dry wool. He had an IV line in his arm. His color had shifted from corpse gray to something marginally more human. His core temperature was climbing. "There is something else you need to know," Doc Elias said. He set down the small flashlight he had been using and chose his words with visible care. I have seen this pattern of injuries before. Not once. This specific combination, the severity of the chronic malnutrition, the cigarette burns, the healed fractures with no medical intervention, the bruising pattern. I reported a case with this same presentation 14 months ago. A child brought into a walk-in clinic in Granville. I called the Licking County Department of Child Services. Garrett waited. The report was closed within 72 hours, Doc, Elias said. Closed without a home visit, without a formal investigation. I was told the matter had been reviewed and found to be unsubstantiated. The name on the closure paperwork was a man named Earl Stuckey. Garrett reached into his shirt pocket and took out a black Sharpie. He uncapped it. He turned his left forearm up and wrote the name Earl Stuckey in large block letters on the inside of his wrist, where he would see it every time he looked at his hand. Fletcher had moved to the corner desk and had his laptop open and his reading glasses on, already working. "Who is Stuckey?" Garrett said. Fletcher did not look up from the screen. "Deputy Sheriff of Licking County, 12-year tenure, clean public record, active member of 3 civic organizations, regular donor to the county food bank." Garrett looked at the name on his wrist. He put the Sharpie away. He pulled the wooden stool from behind the bar and set it beside the pool table and sat down. Not because he was tired, because he had decided to stay close. He folded his arms across his chest and looked at the boy breathing shallowly in the blankets, the IV line running from his thin arm up to the bag Dex had rigged to the pool lamp overhead. Dex came and stood beside him. "Frostbite on the right foot is moderate," he said quietly. "He may lose sensation in the small toe permanently. The malnutrition is the bigger long-term concern. His system has been running on almost nothing for months, not days. But he is stable. His heart is holding." Garrett nodded. They sat with that. "One more thing," Nora said from across the table. She was looking at the boy's left hand. "When I was warming his fingers, something fell out of the bandage I had wrapped around his palm." She set a small object on the felt beside him. It was a scrap of paper, barely larger than a matchbook, folded many times into a tight, square soft from body heat and moisture. It had been pressed flat against the boy's skin, hidden inside the makeshift wrapping. Garrett picked it up. He unfolded it with care. The paper was so thin it nearly tore at the creases. Inside, in a child's unsteady printing, were 7 words. "Please help. I am Eli. I am not trash." Garrett looked at those words for a long time. He thought about what it took to write something like that. Not just the words themselves, but the decision behind them. A child in the dark under a bridge in a blizzard, taking the time to write his own name and press it against his skin. Not giving up. Not accepting the conclusion that had been arranged for him, paying attention even then to the possibility of being found. He folded the paper carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his flannel against his chest. Around 2 in the morning, the boy's eyes opened. Not gradually. They simply opened, one moment sealed shut, the next moment open, revealing irises the color of still water over dark stone, alert and measuring. He stared at the ceiling first. Then he turned his head and found Garrett sitting beside him. Garrett did not move or reach out. He simply met the boy's gaze and held it steady and still, the way you hold steady when a wild animal is deciding whether to run. The boy looked at him for a long time. He looked at the size of him, the beard, the leather, the scar along the jaw. He looked at the other men in the shadows. He looked at the walls with their skull insignia and mounted chrome and faded photographs of men on motorcycles. His expression throughout all of this was not terror. It was assessment. A child who had learned to read rooms for danger before he could fully read words. "Are you the one who decides things here?" the boy said. His voice was a thread, dry and cracked, but it carried. "Yeah," Garrett said. "Then I need to tell you something." Garrett waited. "The van that brought me here," the boy said. "I was watching the license plate from the back window when they stopped under the bridge. I could see it through a hole in the tailgate cover. I counted the letters and numbers and kept saying them in my head so I would not forget. I was afraid I would fall asleep and not wake up, so I kept counting them. The first 3 characters are K7P, Pennsylvania plates." Garrett looked at him steadily. "Why did you do that?" Garrett said. The boy considered the question with a gravity that did not belong on an 8-year-old face. "Because if someone found me," he said, "I wanted them to be able to find the people who did it. And if no one found me, at least I tried." The room held that sentence. One of the men in the shadows shifted his weight. Someone exhaled slowly through his nose. Nora, standing at the far end of the table, pressed her lips together and looked at the floor for a moment. Garrett leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, bringing his face closer to the level of the boy on the table. Not looming, leveling. "What is your name?" he said. "Eli," the boy said. "Okay, Eli, I am Garrett. You are safe in this room. No one here is going to hurt you. Do you understand that?" Eli looked at him the way a person tests ice before putting their weight on it, pressing lightly, checking for give. "Yes," Eli said finally. "Okay." Nora came to stand on the other side of the table. She rested her hand gently on top of the blankets near Eli's shoulder, not touching him directly. Just present. Dex set a mug of lukewarm chicken broth on the edge of the table within Eli's reach and stepped back without comment. Garrett put his own hands flat on his knees and did not touch the mug again. Eli's eyes went to it. Something happened in them, a sudden acute focus, the way a stray animal looks at food while simultaneously bracing for it to be taken away. Garrett held perfectly still. None of the men in the room looked at Eli directly. Dex had handled this quietly, redirecting the two younger prospects with a hand on the elbow and a pointed look. He understood the particular vulnerability of the recently starved, and he knew that being watched while eating was a pressure that could shut a traumatized child down entirely. After a long moment, Eli reached out with his bandaged right hand and curled his fingers around the mug. He drank slowly, small, careful sips. His hands shook throughout. He managed nearly half the mug before he set it down and sank back against the blankets, exhausted by the effort. Garrett waited. "There is something else I need to tell you," Eli said. His eyes were growing heavy, but the purpose in them was keeping him awake. His left hand moved under the edge of the blanket and came back with something so small it was nearly invisible. Another folded scrap of paper pressed flat against the inside of the bandage on his left wrist. "I wrote this 3 nights ago," Eli said. "When they were asleep. I found a pen on the floor behind the radiator. There is a woman named Loretta that Bertie called sometimes when she needed money. I heard the number enough times that I remembered it. I wrote it down. In case." He held the paper out toward Garrett. Garrett took it and unfolded it with the same careful hands. The handwriting inside was a child's uneven print, the letters varying in size, written in near darkness, with a pen balanced in a small, uncertain hand. But the numbers were legible, a full 10-digit phone number. And beneath it, in the same deliberate, careful printing, the same 4 words from the other scrap. "I am not trash." Garrett looked at those words a second time and understood something he had not fully understood the first time. This was not a message to whoever might find him. This was something Eli had written to himself. A truth he was fighting to hold on to. A thing he pressed against his own skin to keep from losing it in the dark. He folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket alongside the first one. He looked up at Fletcher. Fletcher already had his glasses pushed up and his phone in his hand. "Run Licking County Department of Child Services," Garrett said. "Cross-reference Earl Stuckey. Go back 3 years and find the vehicle. Pennsylvania plates K7P. Prefix Chevy Astro, registered to a man named Clyde Weston." Fletcher was already typing. Doc Elias paused in packing his bag. He looked up slowly. "You said Clyde Weston." Garrett looked at him. Doc Elias set his bag down. The nervous energy around him had settled into something heavier. "The case I reported 14 months ago," he said. "The child at the walk-in clinic in Granville. The guardian listed on the intake paperwork was a man named Clyde Weston." The men in the room absorbed this without speaking. "Same guardian," Garrett said. "New child." Doc Elias nodded, and the weight of what that meant came down over the room, like the snow coming down over the roof outside, steady and accumulating and real. Garrett stood up from the stool. He walked to the pool table and looked down at Eli, who had drifted into sleep in the past few minutes, his breathing finally slow and even. He looked at the hinge of the boy's right index finger, the permanent deviation in the bone, the crooked heel that would be there forever. He thought about 2 years of pain in that hand, unaddressed and unacknowledged, carried silently because there had been no alternative. He thought about Grace at 6 years old, who had cried when she scraped her knee on the driveway, and he had run inside for the first aid kit at full speed, his heart in his throat. Fletcher appeared at his elbow. "Found the van," he said quietly. "Chevrolet Astro, registered to Clyde Weston, last known address in Licking County. Current plates match the K7P prefix." He paused. "I also ran Stuckey against Weston in the county property and family records. Earl Stuckey and Clyde Weston are first cousins. They grew up in the same household in Newark, Ohio. Garrett took that in without any visible change in expression. "There is more," Fletcher said. He looked at Garrett over the top of his glasses. "I found 4 prior case closures in the Licking County Child Services system, all bearing Stuckey's signature, and all involving a guardian matching the Weston profile. The closures span 3 years. The most recent, before this one, is from 14 months ago, which matches what Doc Elias described. The one before that involved a 6-year-old boy named Owen Marsh." Garrett waited. "Owen Marsh died 2 years ago," Fletcher said. "Ruled an accident. Stuckey signed the closure within 4 days of the incident report." Garrett looked at the name on his wrist. He looked at the untouched glass of Jack Daniels sitting on the bar top beside the photograph of Grace. He walked to the bar. He looked at the photograph. He picked up the glass. He held it for a moment. Then he set it back down, still full, and turned away. He raised his voice just enough to carry to every corner of the room. "Wake up the charter," he said. "All of them." Fletcher was already moving toward the phone. The charter assembled in less than 2 hours. They came in through the blizzard 1 and 2 at a time, headlights cutting through the whiteout, the sound of engines arriving in waves that the wind swallowed and then released. They came through the side door shaking snow from their cuts, faces raw, and red eyes asking the question before anyone spoke it. 31 patch members of the Iron Ravens Harlan County Charter, plus 6 prospects. Not one of them had complained about the hour. Not one of them had asked on the phone what it was about. Garrett had said all of them, and so all of them came. They stood in clusters around the main room, the collective heat of their bodies slowly pushing back the cold. Nobody was drinking. The pool tables stayed covered. The jukebox stayed dark. Eli had been moved. Dex and Nora had carried him still wrapped in the heated blankets to the small room at the back of the clubhouse that served as an infirmary, a narrow space with a proper cot and a space heater and a shelf of medical supplies that Dex maintained with military precision. The IV bag was rehung from a hook in the ceiling. Doc Elias had gone home with instructions to return in 6 hours. Eli was sleeping with the deep unconscious pull of a body that had finally decided it was marginally safe to let go. Nora stayed in the room with him. Garrett stood at the front of the main room and told him what there was to tell. He kept it short. He was not a man who used 20 words when 5 would do. He described what Nora had found. He described the injuries. He described Doc Elias's prior report and the name Earl Stuckey in the 72-hour closure. He put the family relationship between Stuckey and Clyde Weston on the table plainly, like laying a hand of cards face up. Then he described the van. Pennsylvania plates K7P prefix Chevy Astro registered to Clyde Weston, last known address in Licking County. He described the prior child placements and the case closures. He said Owen Marsh's name and his age and the date he had died and the word accident with a flatness that made it mean its opposite. He said all of this in an even voice. When he finished, nobody asked questions. They understood what had been said and what had not been said. 31 men who operated in a world without many illusions looked at their president and waited. "Fletcher is running the plates in the motel database," Garrett said. "We find the van, we find a location. We do this right. No freelancing." He looked around the room. "We do this right." Nobody objected. He dismissed them to wait and went to find Eli. The back room was lit by a single low-wattage lamp, warm and orange, the space heater humming steadily. Nora was sitting in the folding chair beside the cot, her jacket off her boots, off her feet, tucked under her. She was simply there in the way she had always known how to be, simply there, which was one of the things Garrett had understood about her from the beginning. He came in quietly and closed the door. He pulled a second folding chair from the corner and set it against the wall and sat down. He stretched his legs out and looked at the boy sleeping. In the warmer light with color returning to his face, Eli looked less like a thing that had been abandoned and more like an actual child. His eyelashes lay against his cheeks like dark brush strokes. His hair, drying in the warmth, was a light brown with hints of red when the light caught it. His breathing was slow and regular. His right hand in its bandages rested on top of the blanket. Garrett looked at the crooked finger visible at the edge of the bandage. 2 years, he thought. 2 years of a broken bone in a child's hand healing wrong, because not one adult in his life had seen fit to take him to a doctor. Nora watched him from across the cot. "Of all the days," she said quietly. "Yeah," Garrett said. She did not say anything else about it. That was the agreement. But she looked at him in the way she sometimes looked at him on December 14th, the look that said she knew what it cost him to be upright and functioning today, and that she was glad he was still doing it. He was about to speak when Eli's eyes opened. Not gradually, sudden and fully awake the same as before. He looked at the ceiling first, then around the room. Then he found Garrett against the wall, and some of the acute alertness softened fractionally. "You stayed," Eli said. His voice was stronger than before, still rough but clear. "I stayed," Garrett said. Eli looked at the IV line in his arm without alarm, with the same evaluating attention he brought to everything. "Am I in a hospital?" he said. "No. Back room of our clubhouse. Doc came to you. Eli processed this." Why, he said. Garrett considered how to answer honestly. "Because hospitals ask questions that take time to answer," he said. "And you needed help faster than that." Eli nodded as though this made a practical sense he could respect. They were quiet for a moment. Outside the room faintly, they could hear the movement of men in the main hall, the occasional low-voiced boots on concrete, the charter going about the business of waiting. "You lost someone," Eli said. He was looking at Garrett's left wrist, where the sleeve of his flannel had ridden up enough to show the bottom edge of the tattoo. Just the tail of the letter G and the beginning of the R. Garrett pushed the sleeve down. "Yeah," he said, when Eli said. Garrett looked at him for a moment. 18 years ago today," Garrett said. Eli was quiet. He looked at the ceiling. Then he said, "My mom died 2 years ago. Her name was Helen. She got sick, and she died now, and then the court said Clyde and Bertie were my guardians because there was no one else." Garrett waited. "She would not have let them do this," Eli said. The flatness in his voice was not bitterness. It was the statement of a known fact, something he had weighed and confirmed and filed away. "She was not like them at all. She fixed things. She knew every part of an engine and what it was for. She used to explain them to me when I was little." "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Garrett said. Eli turned and looked at him directly with the unguarded quality that occasionally surfaced between the careful assessments. "Yeah," he said. "She was." They sat with that in the warm, small room, each of them, in the particular company of their particular loss, the space heater ticking and the snow pressing against the high, narrow window. Then Eli said, "Are you going to find them? Already working on it?" Garrett said. "What will you do when you find them?" Garrett held his gaze evenly. "Make sure they answer for what they did to you," he said, "and make sure they cannot do it to anyone else." Eli studied him the way he studied everything patiently and completely. Then he nodded once and closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Garrett sat there a while longer. He looked at Nora. She looked back with the expression she wore when she was not going to say the thing she was thinking, because she trusted him to already know it. He stood, put the chair back against the wall, stood at the door with his hand on the frame, looking back at the cot. Then he went back to work. Fletcher had results by 3:15 in the morning. He had the laptop open on the bar top, 3 browser windows running simultaneously, a legal pad covered in handwritten notes beside him, his reading glasses pushed up into his hair. He had the focused energy of a man doing the thing he was genuinely built to do. "Clyde Weston," he said when Garrett sat down across from him. 43 years old. No steady employment in the past 6 years. Receives a monthly foster care stipend from the state of Ohio for each child placed in his household. He has had 7 placements in the past 4 years. He looked up from the screen. 7 children, Garrett, placed through the Licking County system. Garrett said nothing. Of those 7, Fletcher continued, Cheyenne, have been closed from the system within 18 months of placement with no further tracking record. No adoption finalized. No reunification. No transfer to another placement. They disappear from the active record. He tapped the legal pad. Owen Marsh was the 6th placement. Eli is the 7th. Garrett stared at the legal pad. Fletcher pulled his glasses off and set them on the bar. "I spent 12 years investigating financial crimes. What I am looking at in this record is not negligence, and it is not bureaucratic failure. This is a system being deliberately operated. Weston takes in children for the stipend. Stuckey closes the reports. The children disappear into the gap between what is done to them and what can be proven. And Owen died," Garrett said. "And Owen died." Fletcher picked up the legal pad. The woman named Loretta in Eli's note. I ran the number. Loretta Finn, 38 years old, last known address in Licking County, Ohio. She filed a wrongful death complaint with the state regarding Owen Marsh 2 years ago. The complaint was administratively dismissed within 6 weeks. She has been pursuing it on her own ever since. Where is she now? Garrett said. According to the motel chain's reservation system, Fletcher said carefully she checked into room 119 of the Starlight Motor Inn in Columbiana County 4 days ago. He paused. The Westons are in room 114 of the same motel. Garrett was still. She has been 40 miles from the people responsible for her child's death, Fletcher said quietly. Sitting in the room down the hall from them for 4 days. How did she find them? I do not know yet. But she went looking and she found them, and she has been there 4 days, which means she has something, or she is building something, or she is afraid to move alone. Sawyer, Garrett said. Fletcher nodded. Already called him. He is 40 minutes out. While they waited, Garrett went back to the infirmary one more time. Nora was awake, standing near the door with a mug of coffee, her hair pulled back. She handed it to him when he came in. He drank some of it, standing in the doorway. Eli was sitting up, not fully propped against the wall with the blankets pulled around him. He had eaten something, a piece of toast Nora had brought from the kitchen, and the plate with his crumbs sat on the edge of the cot. There was color in his face now, not much, but enough that he looked like a living child rather than a sketch of one. He looked at Garrett when he came in. You are leaving, Eli said. For a while, Garrett said. Eli looked at his bandaged hand, then back up. When you find Clyde, he said, and stopped. He worked through something, turning it over. You do not have to say anything, Garrett said. Eli shook his head. I want to, he said. He took a breath. When you find him, will you tell him that I remember all of it, every time? He looked at Garrett steadily. Not because I want him to be afraid, because I need him to know that I was paying attention, that none of it just disappeared because he wanted it to. Garrett looked at the boy for a long moment. He walked to the cot and crouched down so he was at eye level with Eli, bringing his size down to something human-scaled. He looked at him directly. I will tell him, Garrett said. Something in Eli's face shifted then, very slightly, the almost invisible relaxation of attention that had been held so long it had become structural, a fist uncurling one finger at a time. Okay, Eli said. His voice was quiet and even. Okay. Garrett put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Then he stood up and looked at Nora and picked up his coffee and walked back through the main room where the charter was gearing up around him, the sounds of zippers and buckles and the low, purposeful murmur of men organizing themselves. Sawyer Holden arrived at 3:58 in the morning, coming through the door with the controlled purposefulness of a man accustomed to being called at unusual hours for serious reasons. He was 58 years old, medium height, lean and straight-backed, with close-cropped silver hair and a face that was angular and watchful. He had spent 19 years as a special agent with the FBI Violent Crimes Against Children Unit before being formally dismissed for insubordinate conduct during a field operation in Cincinnati, where he had deviated from the authorized tactical plan to extract a 7-year-old girl from a structure before the designated entry time. The girl had been alive when he reached her. His career had not survived the decision. He had carried both outcomes without apparent regret. He had been a patched member of the Iron Ravens Nomads chapter for 6 years. He and Garrett had an understanding that was less friendship than mutual recognition. Two men who had arrived at the same conclusions from very different directions. Garrett walked him through everything. Fletcher provided the documentation as they went, turning the laptop towards Sawyer at the relevant moments. Sawyer listened without interrupting, his eyes moving between Garrett and the screen with the systematic attention of a man cataloging information in real time. When Garrett finished, Sawyer was quiet for a moment. Stucky, he said. Garrett pointed to the name on his wrist. Sawyer looked at it. I know that name, he said. 3 years ago, still active, there was an internal flag generated on a county official in Licking County, Ohio, related to a pattern of anomalous case closures in the child services system. The flag was reviewed and buried. I saw the summary before it disappeared from the active file. The name on it was Stucky. Someone in the system buried it, Garrett said. Someone in the system buried it, Sawyer confirmed, which means Stucky has reached beyond Licking County. He paused, which also means that if we go at this wrong, it goes wrong in ways that cannot be undone. Garrett looked at him. Sawyer held the look. I am not saying do not go, he said. I am saying we go right or the whole thing comes apart before it reaches anyone who can make it stick. He glanced at Fletcher. Can you get me Loretta Finn's phone number? Fletcher pushed the legal pad across the bar. Sawyer looked at the number. He looked at the name above it. He said, she has been 4 days in that motel room. He said it the way a man states a fact that deserves to be stated out loud. He picked up his phone and stepped away from the bar. He came back 7 minutes later. His expression had changed. The watchfulness in it had sharpened into something more specific, the look of a man who has just had a piece of information confirm what he already suspected at a higher magnitude than expected. Loretta Finn has been in that motel room because she has been documenting, Sawyer said. She got a job as weekend cleaning staff at a diner 2 miles from the motel 6 weeks ago. The diner where Stuckey eats breakfast every Saturday morning. She sat at the table behind him for 11 consecutive Saturdays. She has recordings on her phone of conversations she was not meant to hear. The last one 3 Saturdays ago is Stuckey accepting a cash payment from a third party in exchange for closing a new report. Fletcher set down his coffee mug. Why has she not taken it to anyone, Garrett said. Sawyer said because the last time she tried to report something about Stuckey, 2 officers from the Licking County Sheriff's Department came to her home at 11 o'clock at night and told her she should be careful about making accusations she could not substantiate. She has been afraid that if she moves through official channels, the recordings disappear the same way Owen's case disappeared. She needs someone to deliver it to people the wrong people cannot lean on, Fletcher said. She needs a path that bypasses Licking County. Entirely, Sawyer said. He looked at Garrett. I still have a contact at the FBI Cleveland field office. A specific agent, a woman I worked with for 6 years who has no connection to Licking County and no reason to protect Stuckey. If Loretta Finn walks into that field office with those recordings and a sworn statement, the case goes federal. It never touches local channels. And Stuckey, Garrett said, cannot bury a federal case the way he buried county reports. Sawyer paused, but it has to happen before he reaches Weston. If Stuckey gets to that motel tonight and they move or destroy evidence, we lose the chain. How long before Stuckey makes a move, Garrett said. Fletcher answered from behind the laptop. He called the motel twice in the last 4 hours from his personal cell. The second call was 38 minutes ago. He knows something is wrong. He is moving tonight. Garrett looked at the clock behind the bar. 4:22 in the morning. He stood up. He looked at Sawyer. You take 4 men and go get Loretta Finn before Stuckey reaches that motel. He looked at Fletcher. Current location of the Weston vehicle. Still in the lot, Fletcher said. Has not moved since yesterday afternoon. Garrett nodded. He walked to the center of the main room. He raised his voice, and it was not a loud voice, not theatrical, but it carried into every corner and collected every set of eyes in the room without effort. He told them about the Starlight Motor Inn. He told them about Clyde and Bertie Weston in room 114. He told them about the other children, the 7 placements, the 5 who had disappeared from the record. He told them about Owen Marsh. He said the name clearly said the age, said the date. He said it because the name deserved to be said in a room full of people who would hear it. Then he said, we ride in 90 minutes. He looked around the room at 31 faces looking back at him. And we do this right. He went back to the infirmary one last time before the ride. Eli was awake, sitting up in the lamplight, the blankets around his waist. He looked at Garrett when he came in with the specific quality of attention that said he had been waiting. Garrett put on his heavy leather cut and settled it across his shoulders. He pulled on his gauntlets. He stood near the door. He said quietly, Eli, before I go, is there anything else you can tell me about them? Anything you heard or saw that might matter? Eli thought about it with his eyes focused on the middle distance, working through his memory the way his mother had taught him to work through an engine, systematically, part by part. Once he said Bertie was on the phone with Loretta late at night. I heard her say that Loretta needed to let it go, or she was going to make things worse for herself. He paused. And another time she said Loretta cannot prove anything without the records. She said it like it made her feel safe. Garrett looked at him. Bertie thought the records were gone, Garrett said. That is what it sounded like, Eli said. Garrett stood with that for a moment. Then he nodded once. Eli looked at him. There was a long pause in which Eli seemed to be measuring something, taking a final reading before committing. Then Eli said, my mom always said that paying attention was the most important thing. She said most people stopped paying attention, and that was how things went wrong. Garrett thought about the two small pieces of paper in his breast pocket. He thought about the license plate characters counted in the dark to stay awake. He thought about a phone number written by a child's hand on the inside of a cereal box and pressed against a pulse point. She was right, Garrett said. He pulled the door closed softly behind him. He walked through the main room where the charter was fully assembled and ready and pushed through the side door and out into the dark. The blizzard had eased while they had been inside. The wind had dropped. The snow was still falling, but gently now, the large, soft flakes of a storm, losing its momentum, drifting down through the beam of the security lights in slow spirals. The compound yard was 2 feet deep in white, and in the silence left by the dying storm, there was only the creak of the chain-link fence in the light wind. Garrett walked to his bike. He brushed the snow off the seat with his gloved hand. He stood beside it and looked out at the gate, at the road beyond it, at the darkness lying in the direction of a county line and a cheap motel, and two people who had spent years believing that the gap between what they did and what could be proven was a permanent and safe condition of their existence. He thought about Eli in the back room sitting up in the lamplight. He thought about a number written with a broken pen on a torn piece of cereal box pressed against a child's skin in the Tarkin case. He thought about Grace, not with the weight of what came after, just the image itself clean and specific. A small, fierce girl on a big motorcycle, both hands on the handlebars, completely unafraid. Garrett swung his leg over the seat. He kicked the engine over. The Harley came to life with the deep, resonant thump he felt in his chest as much as heard the vibration traveling up through the frame and the handlebars and into his palms like a pulse. Behind him, one by one, and then in groups, 31 more engines turned over, filling the compound with sound, a low collective thunder that rose into the winter air and dissolved into the falling snow. He put the bike in gear. He rode toward the gate. The road to Columbiana County was 40 miles of black ice and empty highway, the kind of road that in a blizzard belongs only to the desperate and the determined. Garrett rode at the front. Behind him, the Iron Raven stretched out in a column that filled both lanes' headlights burning through the dark. Sawyer had taken 4 men and left 20 minutes earlier, moving fast and quiet toward the motel, toward room 119, and Loretta Finn. The rest rode with Garrett. And word had spread, the way word always spread through the network, through phone calls made while engines were warming up through the specific frequency that moved between charters when something mattered. The nomads were coming from the north. The Iron Horsemen from the adjacent county were coming from the east. By the time Garrett hit the county line, he could see headlights joining the column from a side road, a dozen bikes folding into the procession without breaking its rhythm, the way tributaries join a river. By the time he passed the first exit for Columbiana, there were riders behind him he did not personally know, men from charters that had heard men who had simply gotten on their bikes. Nobody had been asked to come for Garrett Briggs. They had come because of a boy named Eli, who had written his own name on a scrap of paper in the dark and pressed it against his skin, and decided that trying mattered even when dying seemed more likely than being found. The Starlight Motor Inn materialized out of the dark at 5:47 in the morning, a long, low strip of rooms set back from the highway behind a parking lot that in better seasons would have been unremarkable. The vacancy sign was lit in red. A vending machine near the office threw blue-white light across the snow. The parking lot had been plowed at some point, but the snow had reclaimed most of it, and the cars left overnight wore white hoods and shoulders. The Chevy Astrovan was in the far corner of the lot. Garrett saw it from the highway before he turned in. Even from a distance in the dark, he could see the rust consuming the rear quarter panel. He could see the busted taillight wrapped in something reflective that caught the headlight beams and threw them back silver. He pulled into the lot and stopped. He killed his engine. Behind him, one by one, and then in dozens, and then in waves, every other engine shut down. The sound died in layers, each layer of silence revealing another beneath it, until the last engine ticked off, and the parking lot, and the highway, and the frozen fields beyond held nothing but the whisper of falling snow and the low creak of cooling metal. 912 motorcycles stood in the dark. The parking lot was full. The service road along the side of the motel was full. The shoulder of the highway in both directions was full as far back as the headlights had reached before they went dark. 912 men sat on their machines in the freezing dark and did not speak and did not move. Garrett sat on his bike and looked at the motel. Room 114 was the fourth door from the left on the ground floor. The curtains were drawn. A thread of yellow light showed at the bottom edge of the window where the curtain did not quite reach the sill. He was still looking at that thread of light when a car turned into the far end of the parking lot from the service road. A Licking County Sheriff's Department cruiser. The light bar was off. It was moving slowly the way a vehicle moves when the driver is trying not to be noticed, which is different from how a vehicle moves when it is simply moving slowly. It pulled into a space near the motel office and sat there, engine running, exhaust rising in a white plume. Fletcher, who had ridden up alongside Garrett, said quietly, "That is Stucky." Garrett did not look at Fletcher. He was watching the cruiser. The driver had seen the motorcycles. He had seen them before he turned in, almost certainly from the highway, the mass of them lining the shoulder. He had turned in anyway, which meant either he did not understand what he was looking at, or he had decided that his badge and his cruiser were sufficient protection against whatever this was. He was still sitting in the car. Behind Garrett, 900 men waited. The snow drifted down in the slow, soft flakes of a storm that had nearly finished with itself and settled on the chrome and the leather and the shoulders of the men, and did not melt because everything was cold and still and patient. The driver's door of the cruiser opened. Earl Stucky was a compact man in his early 50s, broad across the chest, with a face that in better light would have read as pleasant and civic-minded. In the cold blue dark at 6 in the morning, with 900 motorcycles arranged around him, his face read differently. He was in partial uniform jacket and trousers, but his shirt untucked and his hair uneven, a man who had dressed in a hurry. He had his hand on his service weapon without having drawn it. He looked at the motorcycles. He looked at Garrett. He appeared to be running a rapid internal calculation involving several variables whose values he was only now fully apprehending. He did not draw the weapon. Garrett swung his leg off the bike and stood up. He handed his helmet to Fletcher without looking at him. He walked across the parking lot toward room 114 at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. He heard Stucky say something behind him. He did not stop. He heard boots crunching on snow, following and then stopping, and then the first 3 digits of a number being dialed on a phone before the sound cut off in a way that suggested someone had taken the phone away. Garrett reached room 114. He raised his right boot and drove it into the door just below the lock, putting his full weight behind it. The hollow core door gave way without resistance, the frame splitting the door, swinging inward, and hitting the interior wall hard. The room was small and smelled of cigarette smoke and the particular stale sweetness of a space that had been inhabited without ventilation for several days. 2 beds, a small table with fast food bags and a lamp, a television on a bracket, the bathroom door open light on. Clyde Weston was on the far bed on his feet before the door finished moving a tall, thin, ropey man in jeans and a t-shirt, his feet bare on the carpet. His face was already preparing an explanation before it understood what it was explaining to. Bertie Weston came out of the bathroom in a housecoat, her eyes carrying the bright, unfocused quality of someone who had been awake for chemical reasons. She opened her mouth. Garrett held up one hand, flat, the way you stop traffic. She closed her mouth. Garrett walked to the small table and pulled the single chair out from it and set it in the middle of the room. He sat down, he put his elbows on his knees, and he looked at Clyde Weston, and he began to speak. His voice was flat and not loud. He said Eli's name. He said what Eli weighed when Nora found him under the Route 9 overpass. He said the temperature at the time of discovery and what prolonged exposure to that temperature does to a child's body. He described the color of Eli's lips and the quality of his pulse when Nora first found it, that fluttering, erratic pulse of a heart close to stopping. He said the number of circular burn marks on Eli's spine. He said the range of their ages from the old smooth scars to the raw, fresh ones, which established a minimum time frame for how long this had been happening. He said the angle at which Eli's right index finger had healed and what that deviation indicated about when the break had occurred, and the fact that not one adult in the boy's life had seen the fit to address it in 2 years. He said Owen Marsh's name. He said it clearly and said the age at which Owen Marsh had died and said the word accident with a particular quality of stillness that made the word mean its opposite. Clyde Weston backed up against the far wall during this recitation. His hands moved against his thighs. His eyes went to the door and back to Garrett and back to the door. "There is nowhere to go," Garrett said. "Not because of what is in the parking lot, because of what is in room 119 and what that woman has been recording for 11 Saturdays and what my people are doing with those recordings right now. Clyde's eyes stopped moving. Bertie made a sound, a single syllable, not a word. Your cousin Garrett said looking at Clyde cannot help you with this one. Earl Stuckey is in the parking lot right now, and the only thing standing between him and a federal agent is about 900 people who came out tonight because of what you did to a boy who weighed 41 pounds when we found him. Clyde Weston slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. He did not do this dramatically. He did it the way a structure does when a load-bearing element gives way a gradual loss of vertical integrity. Bertie began to cry. She said something about not having had a choice, and something about money, and something about it not being supposed to go that far. Her voice rose and broke. Garrett stood up from the chair. He said, Eli told me to tell you something. He said it without inflection as a delivery of fact. He said to tell you that he remembers all of it, every time. Not because he wants you to be afraid. He said it so you would know that he was paying attention. That none of it disappeared just because you wanted it to. Clyde Weston covered his face with both hands and did not uncover it. Garrett walked to the door and stepped to the side. Fletcher and Dex were outside waiting. Between them, they had zip restraints in a small bag of evidence collection materials, sealed plastic bags and latex gloves, and a digital recorder specified by Sawyer, with the precision of someone who understood what made evidence admissible. Go ahead, Garrett said. He walked away from the door and left them to it. Stuckey was still in the parking lot standing beside his cruiser, and he was not alone. Two Iron Ravens had positioned themselves between him and the motel entrance, not touching him, not speaking, simply occupying the space in a way that made the geometry of his situation clear. His phone was in his hand with a partial number on the screen undialed. Garrett crossed the parking lot and stopped 6 feet from Stuckey. Close enough to be a statement. Far enough to be legal. You are about 30 minutes too late for that call to help you, Garrett said. Stuckey looked at him, his jaw was working. Whatever speech he had been assembling about lawful authority and interference with an officer appeared when confronted with Garrett's face to be inadequate to the situation. There is a woman named Loretta Finn, Garrett said. She has been in room 119 for 4 days with recordings of 11 conversations, one of which involves you accepting a cash payment in exchange for closing a report regarding a child. He paused. She left this motel 40 minutes ago. She is currently in a vehicle driven by a former FBI special agent who used to work in the Violent Crimes Against Children unit and who has a direct line to the Cleveland field office that does not pass through your reach. Stuckey's face changed. Not dramatically. The muscles around his eyes tightened, and the color shifted in a way that was visible, even in the dark, a deep draining of something that had been maintained by the long assumption of safety. Earl Stuckey said a voice to Garrett's left. 2 figures were walking across the parking lot from the service road. A woman and a man, both in civilian clothes, both carrying the bearing of people who move through the world with institutional weight even when they were not in uniform. The woman was in her late 40s, dark coat credentials case already open in her hand. The man was younger, walking half a step behind. Special Agent Vicki Chambers, FBI, Cleveland Field Office, the woman said. She was looking at Stuckey with the calm, practiced attention of someone who had spent 20 years building cases. Earl Stuckey, I am placing you under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant authorized this morning at 4:51 a.m. in connection with charges including obstruction of justice conspiracy to commit child endangerment and deprivation of rights under color of law. The younger agent was already around Stuckey's left side. The sound the handcuffs made when they locked was small and metallic and clean in the cold winter air. Not a dramatic sound, a mechanical sound, the simple operation of a simple device. But in the silence of the parking lot with 900 men sitting still on 900 motorcycles and the snow drifting down in its unhurried way, it landed with the weight of something that had been a long time coming. Nobody cheered. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 900 men sat on their machines and watched Earl Stuckey walk across a parking lot in handcuffs toward a federal vehicle, and the silence they kept was more total and more final than any noise could have been. Garrett watched him go. He thought about a file in a county office in Licking, Ohio with a child's name on it and a closure stamp and a signature. And another file behind it with another name. And another behind that, and 5 children who had disappeared into the gap between what was done to them and what could be proven. And one child who had not made it out. He said Owen Marsh's name quietly to the cold air. Just the name. just so it was said one more time by someone who meant it. Then Garrett turned and looked back at the motel. On the far side of the parking lot near the service road entrance, a woman was standing in the dark. She was thin and very still in a heavy coat, her hands at her sides. She was watching the federal vehicle pull away with Stuckey in the back seat. She had been standing there for some time, he realized, watching the whole thing from a distance. Loretta Finn. She was not crying. She was just standing there watching the car take Stuckey away, and in her face, even at this distance, in this light, was something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them, the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long that putting it down does not feel the way they imagined it would. It felt stranger than that, emptier and fuller at the same time. Sawyer walked to where she was standing and stopped beside her. He did not say anything. He just stood next to her, and they both watched the taillights of the federal vehicle disappear around the bend in the service road, and then they stood there in the dark and the snow together for a while longer after that. Garrett looked at them for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to his bike. The ride back was slower than the ride out, quieter in a way that was distinct from tactical silence, quieter the way things are quiet after a conclusion rather than before one. The blizzard had fully spent itself, and the sky to the east, still dark, but no longer uniformly black, had the quality of a sky beginning to remember the sun. The snow on the road was compacted and silver under the headlights. Garrett rode and thought about Eli. He thought about the mug of broth and the half a mug that had been enough for one night. He thought about the phone number written in a child's unsteady hand on a torn corner of a cereal box and pressed against a pulse point and in the dark. He thought about the first piece of paper, the one that had said, "I am not trash," and the way Eli had written that, not as a plea to whoever found him, but as a truth he was holding for himself. He thought about what it meant that Eli had his mother's quality of attention, her belief that paying attention was the most important thing, that most people stopped paying attention, and that was how things went wrong. He thought that Helen, whoever she had been, had given her son something that could not be taken away, the way other things could be taken away, something that had survived 2 years of Clyde and Bertie Weston, and a broken finger, and a bridge in a blizzard. He thought he would have liked to have known her. The compound came into view at 7:40 in the morning, the corrugated steel walls emerging from the gray pre-dawn light, the chain-link fence with its razor wire catching the first pale suggestion of color in the eastern sky. The gate was open. Nora had left it open. Garrett rode through and stopped in the center of the yard. He killed the engine. Behind him, the column followed him in riders peeling off to either side, bikes settling into rows across the snowed-over gravel. The process took several minutes. The yard filling gradually, engines shutting down one after another until the last one went quiet, and the compound held nothing but the sound of cooling metal and the soft sigh of the wind moving through the chain link. Garrett sat on his bike and looked at the loading dock. Nora was standing there. She was in her heavy coat, a mug in her hand, steam rising from it in the cold. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She was looking at him with the particular expression that said she knew how it had gone because she knew him and because she had been waiting to read the result in the way he carried himself when he came through the gate. Beside her, in the old steel-framed wheelchair that Dex had retrieved from back storage and outfitted with a folded moving blanket across the seat and another across the lap, was Eli. He was sitting upright, propped against the back of the chair, with the blankets wrapped around him, his bandaged right hand visible on the armrest. He had been dressed in a flannel shirt several sizes too large, one of Nora's rolled at the cuffs. His hair had been washed and dried and showed the light brown with the red in it, cleaner now, more itself. His face had color that had not been there when Nora found him under the bridge. He was looking at the horizon, at the line where the dark met the approaching light, where the sky was beginning its slow, irreversible shift toward dawn. Garrett dismounted. He climbed the metal stairs to the loading dock, his boots ringing on each step in the quiet morning air. He stood at the top and looked at Eli. Eli turned his head and looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The 900 men in the yard behind Garrett were still, and the snow on the compound roof was still, and the sky was moving toward light, the way it always moved toward light, steadily and without asking permission. And in that stillness, the two of them looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when something large has been carried from one place to another and set down. "They got them," Garrett said, "both of them. And the man who was helping them, he is in federal custody." Eli held his gaze. He let that settle. His face did not break into relief the way a face does when something feared has suddenly passed. It changed more slowly than that, more fundamentally, the way something changes when a load has been removed that has been present so long it had been mistaken for a permanent feature of the landscape. He nodded once, a single nod, deliberate and complete. Garrett reached up and removed his heavy leather riding gloves. He held them in one hand. He looked at Eli for one more moment, at this 8-year-old boy who had counted license plate characters in the dark to stay awake, who had written his own name on a scrap of paper and pressed it against his skin, who had asked a stranger in a room full of strangers whether he was the one who decided things, and then when told yes, had said, "I need to tell you something." Garrett lowered his head. Not a bow, not a performance, simply a man lowering his head, his chin toward his chest in front of another person. Behind him, Fletcher lowered his head, then Dex, then the two prospects nearest the dock, then spreading outward from the front like a wave moving through deep water slowly and without signal. 900 men lowered their heads in the gray December morning in a frozen compound in northeastern Ohio. The silence that followed was not the silence of restraint or ceremony. It was the silence of 900 people simultaneously and genuinely still, each one in whatever private place the gesture took them, each one carrying some version of what this was. Eli looked at them. He looked at the rows of bowed heads stretching across the yard and out through the gate and down the access road as far as he could see in the early light. He looked at all of it for a long time with the steady, careful attention he brought to everything, taking it in completely part by part, the way his mother had taught him. Then he leaned back in the chair, and his shoulder found Nora's hip where she stood beside him, and he let his weight rest against her just slightly, the way a person lets their weight rest against something when they have decided after sufficient evidence that it will hold. Garrett raised his head. Around him, 900 heads came up. The sky to the east was fully committed to dawn now, the black giving way to a deep cold blue, the first pale silver light catching the snow on the compound roof, and the chrome on the bikes and the chain-link fence, and turning everything it touched into something briefly and improbably bright. Nora handed Garrett his coffee. He drank it standing beside Eli, looking out at the yard, at the men beginning to move in quiet clusters, at the sky getting light over the rusted steel edges of the compound. The days after were not simple. Recovery does not work that way. Justice does not work that way. The Licking County case opened into a federal investigation that would take months and would touch more names than Earl Stuckey and more files than Fletcher had found in a single night. There would be hearings. There would be depositions. There would be days when the machinery of the law moved so slowly it seemed not to be moving at all. Loretta Finn gave her recordings and her statement to Special Agent Chambers in a Cleveland field office conference room at 7 in the morning on December 14th. She sat across a table from a federal agent for the first time in 2 years with something functioning like protection around her, and she talked for 4 hours. When she was done, she walked out into the parking lot and sat on a bench and allowed herself to cry in a way she had not allowed since Owen died. Sawyer Holden sat beside her on that bench and did not say anything and did not go anywhere. And after a while, the crying stopped and they sat there in the cold together for a while longer, watching the Cleveland traffic move past on the street below. And eventually she said thank you, and he said it was Owen, and she understood what he meant. Clyde and Bertie Weston were processed by the Columbiana County Sheriff's Department, their case attached to the federal investigation processed through channels that had no connection to Licking County. The evidence collected by Fletcher and Dex in room 114, gathered according to Sawyer's specifications, was admissible at every level it needed to be admissible. Eli's account, given in a formal interview conducted 6 weeks later when he was strong enough, was meticulous and precise and unshakable. He remembered everything, all of it. He had been paying attention. The 5 children who had disappeared from the Licking County foster care record were found one at a time through an investigation that expanded as federal attention widened the aperture of what was being examined. 3 were placed in new homes. 1 had aged out of the system and was living independently in Indiana. 1 was still being searched for as this story reaches its end, and that search continues. In the spring, Owen Marsh received a headstone in a cemetery in Licking County, Ohio. It was paid for by a collection taken at an Iron Ravens charter meeting, passed around in a coffee can, from hand to hand, without commentary. Nobody had proposed it formally. Fletcher had simply set the can on the bar one evening, and the can had moved around the room and come back full. The stone was plain granite, his name on it in full. Owen James Marsh, his dates. The number 6, which was how old he had been. Nothing else was needed. On the morning the headstone was placed, Garrett drove out to the cemetery alone. He stood at the grave for a while in the cold spring air, with his hands in his pockets, and the smell of turned earth around him, and the sound of birds somewhere in the trees at the cemetery's edge. He did not say anything out loud. He was not a man who said things out loud to the dead. He just stood there and was present with it the way he had always believed the dead deserved. On the drive back, he stopped at a gas station and bought a cup of coffee and stood beside his bike in the parking lot and drank it in the thin spring sunlight, and he felt for the first time in a very long time that he was standing in the right place. Eli took longer than 6 months to sleep without checking the door. He took longer than 6 months to eat without watching the plate. He woke some nights with a fear that did not respond to logic that had to be waited out in the particular darkness of a room where the door was left open and the hallway light was on. Some mornings, the first thing his nervous system registered was the crooked pull of his right index finger, the permanent deviation in the bone, and the memory that lived in that angle. These things did not resolve quickly because they were not the kind of things that resolve quickly. They were the kind of things that change over time slowly and unevenly, with setbacks and increments of progress too small to see until you looked back over a longer span and noticed the distance. What changed faster was the garage. Garrett had cleared a section of the compound shop in February and set aside a workbench at a height appropriate for a child. He had pulled parts from storage and laid them out in a logical sequence on the bench surface. He had not announced what he was doing. He had simply been doing it one afternoon when Eli wandered in, drawn by the sounds and the smell of the shop, and stood in the doorway watching. Garrett had not looked up. He had kept working his hands, moving over the parts with the unhurried competence of a man who had been doing this for 3 decades. The shop was warm, the space heater running, the smell of oil and metal filling the air, the way it had filled every shop he had ever worked in. Eli came inside. He stood at the workbench and looked at the parts. After a while, he reached out and picked one up, examining it in his left hand, the good hand turning it over. "That is a primary drive sprocket," Garrett said without looking up. "I know," Eli said. "My mom showed me one." Garrett set down what he was holding. He looked at the boy across the workbench. "Show me what else you know," he said. That had been the beginning of the garage. By spring, Eli was in the shop most afternoons. He was not a fast learner because he was rushing. He was a careful learner because he applied the same attention his mother had given him to everything, examining each thing from multiple angles before committing to an understanding of it, asking questions that were precise and that revealed a mind that had been working on the problem before it asked. By May, he could name every major component of a Harley-Davidson Sportster engine and describe its function and its relationship to adjacent components. He could do this in the systematic, confident language of someone who understood not just the names, but the logic, the why of each thing, and how it connected to everything else. Helen Garrett thought sometimes watching him work, "You did good." The Harley miniature had started in March, not as a project, but as an accident. Garrett had been sorting parts from an old bin and had set aside a collection of small pieces too worn to use on a functioning bike, but too complete to discard. Eli had picked them up one afternoon and arranged them on the workbench in the configuration of a motorcycle and looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Garrett had looked at them too. The next day, he had brought a frame from the back of the storage room, scaled down, designed for a display model he had begun years ago and never finished. He had set it on the workbench without comment. The miniature had taken them 4 months. They had not worked on it every day. Some days Eli had not wanted to be in the shop, and on those days, Garrett had not asked him to come in. Some days Eli had come in and worked in silence, using his hands the way other people use words. On those days, Garrett had worked beside him without speaking, and the shop had been quiet except for the sounds of tools and parts and the heater, and occasionally the distant sound of bikes on the access road. The miniature was finished on a Thursday in July. A hot day, the Ohio summer pressing down on the corrugated roof, making the interior warm in a way that was almost comfortable. Eli installed the last piece himself, a small chrome element, on the handlebars that had come from the original bin, worn smooth but intact. He stood back and looked at it. Garrett stood beside him. The miniature sat on the workbench in the full proportion of a real motorcycle, every component in its correct position, every surface finished to the best of what their materials and tools allowed. It was not perfect. It was something that two people had made together over a span of months, and every part of it showed that. Garrett reached into the cabinet behind the workbench and took out a small sheet of vinyl lettering, custom-cut white letters on a clear background. He set it on the bench in front of Eli. Eli looked at it. The letters read Eli Briggs. He looked at them for a long time. Then he picked up the sheet and peeled the backing carefully and applied it to the seat of the miniature, pressing each letter down with the pad of his thumb, working from left to right slowly and precisely. He smoothed the last letter and sat back. Garrett had not filed the adoption paperwork yet. He would file it the following Monday, and it would take 7 more months to finalize, and there would be a hearing in a county courthouse, and signatures, and a judge who would ask Eli directly if this was what he wanted, and Eli would say yes with the same direct, uncomplicated gravity with which he said everything. But none of that had happened yet on the Thursday in July in the shop. What had happened was a name on a miniature motorcycle pressed down with a child's thumb, letter by letter. Garrett looked at it. He was 54 years old. He had spent 30 years in leather and on asphalt and in the hard gray margins of a world that did not offer much in the way of uncomplicated things. He had loved his daughter and lost her and carried that loss through 18 years of December 14th without being destroyed by it, which was perhaps the central achievement of his life. He did not think that Eli replaced Grace. He knew better than most people how that did not work. Grace was Grace and Eli was Eli, and the human heart was not a vessel with a fixed capacity that filled and emptied and refilled. It was something else, something he did not have precise language for, but that he had learned over a long winter and a spring and a summer in a garage with a boy who knew the names of engine parts and paid attention to everything could expand. He put his hand on Eli's shoulder. The boy leaned against him slightly with the trust of a person who has decided after careful consideration and sufficient evidence, gathered over a long enough period, that a thing will hold. Outside the shop, the summer afternoon moved over the compound in its long golden light, touching the chrome of the bikes in the yard and the chain link of the fence and the corrugated steel of the walls, and somewhere on the access road, a single engine turned over, came to life, and pulled away down the road toward wherever the road was going, the sound of it rising and then fading and then becoming part of everything else.